Greetings. This is Introduction to Counseling, and we're going to talk about psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy. Sigmund Freud was the person who invented talk therapy. That is to say, he figured out, after observing clients who would speak about some of the difficulties that they had, would enable them to rid themselves of some of the anxiety associated with those events or those concerns. Sigmund Freud was it. He had no real peers. He developed theories, although they might not be amenable to empirical examination, were nonetheless brilliant and interesting and explained an awful lot of things. He was the guy in the 20th century, all over Time magazine. All over. He started out as a psychiatrist and then neurologist, which at that time was not the way it is now, certainly. And he was from Austria and then emigrated to the United States. But he was all over the place. He was seen as both controversial and brilliant. He was born in Freiburg, Austria in the mid-1800s, before the Civil War, and he was very impressed in his medical work during his medical school training with the idea of how you might talk to people in ways that would help them. So he wrote an awful lot. He wrote tremendous numbers of books and papers and so on. In fact, he really helped us understand things like love and hate and civilization and sexuality and fantasy and family relations. He just really, he was so creative and so driven that I doubt anyone could keep up with the guy. So what does psychoanalysis provide as a formulation of both theoretical ideas and processes of therapy? Well, he provided us a theory for why an individual comes to suffer difficulties. He talked about the early development of an individual, its frustrations, its desires, and he had a set of very interesting ways of getting at the unconscious motivations and things hidden from the individual that could be revealed, including interpreting, recalling, saying the first thing that came to your mind, looking at dreams, all sorts of things. And the idea was that the individual would begin to come to terms with the individual history that they had. He believed that insight alone was sufficient, that if a client had insight as to the origins of their problems, they would no longer have those problems. But that's a simplistic statement about his goal, because it also included developing new ways of thinking and behaving, though not in the sense we think of those things today. So his early theoretical work involved sexuality even in infancy. And he reasoned that, you see babies playing with their genitals because it feels good. He made more of it than that, for sure. We see that in the womb as well. He thought that adult psychological illnesses emerged from conflicts between the sexual desires and aggressive desires, more commonly sexual desires, and society's restraints on those desires, you see. He wrote, as I said, many, many things, including studies on hysteria in the late 1800s, interpretation of dreams, a seminal work in 1900, the psychopathology of everyday life, jokes in the relation to the unconscious, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in 1905. That's where he brought in erogenous zones, which we still think about today in some ways, differently. Childhood sexuality, sublimation, the transference of conflicts that are unconscious into socially acceptable activities. Beyond the pleasure principle, the ego and the id, future of illusion, civilization as discontent. This guy was prolific. So he had three areas of the brain, three parts of the brain, if you will. He called one part the conscious mind, which is the part that we're familiar with, actually, from moment to moment, attuned to the events of the present and an awareness of the outside world. That was his definition of the conscious mind, okay? And then the preconscious mind was between the conscious and the unconscious mind, which held memories and events in some ways forgotten, or at least partially forgotten. It contains aspects of both conscious and unconscious, actually, but it contains things that are hidden, like those memories, forgotten experiences. And if you got the right cues, sound-wise, or a similar idea, you would be able to remember them. They would come up for you. The tip of the tongue phenomenon is what that is, yeah? You see his fascinating structure that he's developing here. And the unconscious mind, you can't directly see this or know about it. It's beneath the preconscious mind. So it's least available to us consciously. It's the most powerful. It's the least understood part of personality. It's totally instinctual. It's repressed, which is automatically pushing things that are difficult and conflictual and horrible into the unconscious. And so this part is the part he wanted to get at when he was doing psychoanalysis with people. He wanted to find out what those conflicts were, and so he had to develop ways to get at what's in the unconscious, all right? Now, those three areas of the mind are different than the structure of the personality. So the structure of the personality contained the ego, the superego, and the id. The ego is the part of the let me start with the id. Yeah, ego. So ego is the part of the mind that moderates the wishes and drives and instincts from the unconscious, the id, and the super perfectionist moralistic superego. Okay? And it develops, he said, around 2 to 3 years of age, and it operates according to what he called rational thinking, or more specifically, secondary process thinking. Okay? Interesting. Interesting. So this reality principle that it operates on devises ways to achieve appropriate goals. It obtains its energy it obtains energy for activities from the id, and keeps the person in harmony with their immediate surroundings, their social setting, their environment. Now, the superego contains elements of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious parts of the mind, and it's the upholder of values and ideals. It's the moral branch. It is roughly, but not exactly, the same as a conscience. It's not exactly the same. And so it's directly opposite of the id, you see, directly opposite of the id. It develops around age 5, and it functions according to the moral principle. Strive for perfection, arises from parental and social and moral teachings. It internalizes all of that, and it's not bound by reality, so it strives for perfection. Okay? Now the id is present from birth. So we're born with instincts. It pursues what it wants because it can't tolerate any frustration and cannot wait for what it wants. It's the most primitive part of the mind. It's the animal part of our brain in some ways. It's the source of all our drives and urges. It is amoral, it is impulsive, and it is irrational, he said. It contains the basic life energy and life-preserving instincts for the individual. He called that eros. And the psychic energy that accompanies them and drives is known as libido. It operates through the drives and instincts and images which occur in, he said, forms like dreaming and hallucinating and fantasizing, as a process known as primary process. Now, we use that term loosely now in some ways, in some corners by clinicians, to indicate that the person is probably psychotic. If a person is primarily motivated in their behavior by the id that they have, the primary drives that are unfettered and unfiltered, then we're probably looking at someone who is psychotic. We know that in some psychotic disorders, there's a lot of fantasy, and I think that's a wrong association to make, basically, but people do that. Okay, so again, the ego contains elements of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. The superego contains all three as well, mostly unconscious, and the id is entirely unconscious. This is brilliant, I think. You could go on for days talking about this one subject, of course. Now, what got him in trouble at first, but which held sway over time because there were no real excellent competing theories about the structure and motivations and passage through stages of life. He got in trouble because he called them the psychosexual stages of development. He talked about the development of personality through a sequence of invariant stages. You move from one to the next, you don't go backwards. But you can get stuck, which he called fixation. So we have the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. Okay. So these stages are based on the location of the energy of the id. And in order to move through a healthy developmental process, then gratification within those areas, those erogenous zones, must occur. You have to move beyond them. You have to have appropriate gratification. Overindulgence or underdivulgence, which would be called deprivation, I suppose. Yes, deprivation would create what he called fixation. So that's where the id energy gets stuck. It doesn't move forward to eventually landing in the genital region, which you thought was mature. So the oral stage is the first year and a half, infancy. And we know that kiddos put everything in their mouth to experience it, both the texture and taste and so forth. We know that they're looking for food. They need food. Everything is sort of mouth-oriented. Well, he thought this is actually a kind of gratification that's very basic from sucking and biting on things, most obviously from the breast, but otherwise things that in the environment. He said, for example, if this didn't move to the next stage, the anal stage, and you got stuck and you were underindulged, then you would have issues in adult. He linked the fixation, over or underindulgence, to adult psychopathology. See, if you were underindulged, if the mom ceased breastfeeding or you didn't feed enough, for example, then people might have such habits as smoking and so on in adulthood. I'm giving you very simple examples. The anal stage is about 1.5 years to 3 years, and of course we know this is where toilet training takes on a battlefield in some cases, not always. But this is where a child, he said, delights in either withholding or expelling feces. And he thought, well, adults find relief in getting rid of feces. That was a pleasurable thing. There's no more congestion and pressure. So this is where we really see the beginnings of conflicts between a child and which have to do with the internal instincts that the kiddo has and external demands of the parents. Okay, and he had all sorts of things associated with fixation in this stage. For example, if you were overly punished or the emphasis was too great on withholding feces and you felt very much conflicted about that, then you might end up with what he called an anal retentive personality. Very neat, clean, orderly, that sort of thing in adulthood. And then if you if you really were not given any special requirements to withhold your feces, and you just went all over the place all the time, there were no restrictions at all, then you might end up with what he called an anal expulsive personality. He said in adulthood this might lead to something like sadism. I'm not quite sure where he gets that. I have not been trained in psychoanalysis. I have only studied it to some degree. Next stage is phallic, the phallic stage. This is between 3 and 5, and this is where they develop a sexual dilemma, and both males and females have to work through this dilemma. He thought the basic ingredients of adult personality were formed at the end of this stage. He had two things that you may be familiar with as part of this stage. One is the Oedipus complex, and the other is the Electra complex. The Oedipus complex is where the boy has to work through a desire to sexually possess his mother, and so he's at odds and in competition with father, and he develops what he called castration anxiety. So he worried he was going to be castrated in the battle with his father. Got pretty wild, wasn't it? And then the Electra complex, which he developed somewhat later for females, in which in which a girl blames her mother for her not having a penis. How misogynist can you be? That's where penis envy comes from, you see. Coming up in the next video, we're going to talk about the final stages and more on how this therapy operates.